Welcome to the IDPro Show, your spot for hearing about how to grow your career in digital identity. I'm Heather Flanagan, Executive Director of IDPro and Principal Editor for the Body of Knowledge.
I'm Chris Cochran from AKA Identity. We're here to introduce you to the world of expert insights and deep discussions in the world of identity. Whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out your journey in the digital identity arena, this show is your gateway to the latest trends, knowledge, and career advice.
So we're here today to talk with Lance Peterman. Lance leads the identity program at Dick's Sporting Goods while attempting to stimulate a movement to inject digital identity curriculum into higher education. He's an Emeritus Board Member and former Chair of IDPro, as well as a poll worker overseeing elections in his local precinct, and is an avid, but he claims below average runner and enjoys life on a small horse farm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Lance, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, glad to have you, Lance. I think you've been heard saying that some aspire to work in identity and others have it thrust upon them. Tell us a little bit more about your entrance into the field of identity.
Sure. So I'm one of the people who, love to say I was doing identity before they called it identity type things. And it's a true statement because what we were doing back then was commonly known as like systems administration,
Right.
Getting people access to the stuff that they needed access to, generating identities when they needed to generate them. And one day my boss came to me and said, hey, our CIO has heard that there's this thing called identity management and we want you to do it. And I'm like, okay, cool. So am I going to get any resources to do this with? And they're like, no, it's probably just going to be you and then just grab whoever you can grab. Okay, well, we're going to get any money to do this with? And they said, we might be able to fund a product, but we'll see. Which we'll see, anybody who's a parent, we'll see usually means no. But we did wind up funding a product. But as you could probably guess from that setup, you can tell how the project went. I started knocking on some doors, asking some questions that people didn't want to answer, like, hey, can I connect directly to your HR system so that I can discover when we hire somebody or when we terminate someone? And they went, yeah, no. So that was that's why I say it was kind of thrust upon it. Is like, hey, go do this and let us know how it goes. And needless to say, it was not successful. The company in question, again, I don't like to name names. The company in question has a successful identity program today. They just, like most companies, have had to have at least 2 to 3 starts before they actually get the ball rolling. So
you might want to say that they needed a little bit of education.
One could say that, yes. And it's interesting that you say that, just because when I reflect back on it, one of the pieces that I've talked about a number of times, and I keep kind of batting this ball around a little bit about having a session on really how to evangelize identity within your own company. Because that was, if I were to pick one of many failures in that first learning pass, one of them was to help people understand what identity is and why it's so important. Because so many people just don't have that knowledge or that perspective, and they're not faulted for doing so. It's identity is that invisible layer that if it works well, they don't even pay attention to it.
Absolutely. Coming into the theme of education, which you knew we were going to do, because you are one of my favorite people to talk to about the industry and its perspective in higher education. So you have actually started education but at a layer that most people don't even touch, working in higher education. So you're someone who was just thrown into the deep end, and now you're actually changing that around to give students a better exposure to the field. How on earth did you get to break into teaching like that?
Well, I kind of made a promise to myself. I wanted to teach early in my higher ed experience. The challenge was I discovered in the state of Texas how much they paid teachers back then. And it just the numbers just didn't work out. So I made a promise to myself. I said, at some point, you're going to go back, you're going to get your master's degree, and you're either as a retirement path or hopefully maybe before that, you're going to come back and teach. So I kind of made that promise to myself. And early in the 2010s, thanks to my company I was working with at the time, they funded my master's education. And it kind of accomplished two objectives. The first one, obviously, was having a master's degree kind of unlocks the door for teaching in certain sectors, including higher ed. And the other one was it really gave me a peek behind the curtain in terms of how higher ed had changed over the decades. Because needless to say, my bachelor's degree was a few decades ago. So seeing both of those things gave me some perspective on, okay, maybe this is what I want to teach overall. And I had not planned at the time for several years once I finished my master's to even do that. But as luck would have it, or fate, you might say, I got a phone call literally while we were driving back, Chris, from Dallas to Charlotte, North Carolina. I got a phone call from someone at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and they were looking for someone to teach a software architecture and design class. And I had some experience in that, but I was like, am I ready? And of course, you're never ready. But I said, sure. And so I gave it a crack. And that was 9 years ago. I'll be starting my 10th year this fall. And one of the fun things about teaching software architecture and design when you work in the field of identity is it introduces that perspective that students don't even begin to think about of really what is it that we're creating, because typically most systems that we're creating today are not a system unto themselves. Like I always use the example of a stopwatch application. Okay, that can probably stand alone, but very few applications actually do that. We have to talk to other things. And so the ability to start with that understanding, and now through my experience with IDPro, I realized how inadequate the training was, particularly in computer science, but not just in that realm. Also, when you can look at other fields, like, for example, in the business college, giving marketing folks the understanding of what consumer data does and how it can be used and how it can be misused. I just saw it really unlocked an entire world of if we could get people oriented with this type of knowledge before they cross the stage and get that piece of paper. That's how we're going to create future identity professionals, at least in one vector. There are certainly other ways of doing it, but I think if we can achieve that in higher ed, I think that's a huge win for the industry and honestly for our software as a whole.
I love it. And I've been a teacher myself. I've taught everything from networking basics, security, cybersecurity leadership, physical pen testing, and each and every one of those paradigms, there's always been those concepts that are just really tough for students to grasp. What would you say are the most challenging concepts for your students to grasp when it comes to identity?
This is still very much a work in progress because confession, I've only taught one identity class thus far. I'm teaching the second iteration of this fall. The first thing I thought, and I think I may have been too clever by a half, was I thought you can't really start to do this unless you have a systems view of the world.
Right.
And so the very first thing I had them do was consume this article on systems thinking, because I thought that was a great way of kind of pouring the foundation for it. And I don't think I'm entirely wrong, but I think starting off with that was kind of got them on the wrong foot, and it started creating more confusion than understanding. So one of the things that I am trying to do is figure out, I still want to pursue that, and I still want to have that part of their understanding as part of this class, because that's really where most of the identity problems show up is if it's just a confined system unto itself, and then you have a username and your password, unfortunately, to log into that system, identity is not really a challenge. It's when you're trying to talk to the other systems out in the world. And so if I can start with that understanding somehow and maybe infuse it, maybe in breadcrumbs as we go along, I'm hoping maybe to unlock that a little bit to help people understand where some of the challenges are. Yeah. The biggest one that, besides systems thinking, that I feel like they need to grasp is we are only as good as the data that we have. And this is where I have struggled in every organization that I've worked with is I need access to your HR data. It doesn't have to be direct access. And I'm going to ask you some uncomfortable questions about the quality of that data.
Yes.
And that's where so many challenges in identity exist, is having to do that transformation process that we don't really sign up for as part of identity in that regard. And yet we still wind up being responsible for it. So I would say those are the two big challenges.
Those are two pretty big challenges. And another one I kind of think of is I have three daughters, right? I have a 15, about to be 16-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and they're in very different stages in their life. But then I'm also looking at how they're interacting with technology, and the way they interact with technology is very different from the way I came up, the way you came up. What are some of the ways in which they're thinking about identity and online privacy, and what do you think those different ways of thinking are going to change the workforce identity and other identities going forward?
Ooh, that's a great one. That was one of the early challenges that I had, even just not within the identity problem, but in teaching software architecture and design. But it's kind of the same problem, was because I was about to say children. They're not children. These young adults are digital natives, and so they've grown up with most of this. And so many of them, even though they're in the computer science program, many of them lack a fundamental curiosity about how some of these things work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that digital identity forces you to do is you have to understand how these systems work at some level. You don't need to know everything about everything with respect to how these systems work, but particularly how you gain access to them is one of them. And the natural flow of that is, okay, now that I have access to them, you have my data. How are you using my data? And I think that's the one where I would hope the youngest generations today get more curious about, I know I'm giving you a lot of data as a result of this transaction. What are you doing with that? Because I think that's one of the fundamental questions that we're doing a very poor job of answering, which honestly, talking about consent management can be a podcast into itself. But I think that's where one of the struggles are.
I wonder if in not being curious about that, because they're just so embedded in the space, is resulting in a certain amount of choosing not to be online, choosing not to expose their data. I've been hearing more and more about Gen Z who's saying, you know what, I don't even want to do anything except text messages because I know people are just going to track me. Is that something that you hear at all from your students?
I am seeing it somewhat. I would say that is a very distinct minority still.
Okay.
Most of them, and it's human nature. Number one, we're social beings. So you're correct, Heather, in that some of them have said, you know what, my highest common denominator is going to be text messaging. Anything above that, I'm not participating in. But I would say the vast majority of them they're on Discord servers, which, a lot of students don't even think about what, if anything, is happening with the data that they produce on Discord. It's free. It's where we go to collaborate. It's where we go to game and things like that. And so something as mundane as that, there's not really, there's not an attempt to educate, and there's definitely not curiosity. I will say on the privacy side, I think we're getting some inroads in higher ed. There are some dedicated privacy classes out there. I think they're still, I think IAPP would agree that they're still trying to get inroads in that space, but it's so complementary to what we're trying to do in the identity space. I think there may be some good opportunities to partner in that.
So talking about the education, that's one end of the identity profession supply chain, but IDPro is, I don't want to say more towards the other end, but it does, assume that you're now in the field. Still, I think you see a strong connection between IDPro's mission and what you're doing, working with students. So say more about that.
As soon as Ian and Sarah took the stage to introduce IDPro as a working organization back in Chicago, I was hooked. I mean, I was literally signing up on the PayPal account while the keynote was going on. And, because I believed in the mission. Part of it is a reflection of where I'm at in my career. The biggest gift I can give at this point is helping other people develop in that space. And to your point, Heather, you're going to attack that from a number of different vectors. Some of it is still going to be getting that direct training, and there are some vehicles out there for that. But one of the challenges that we always had in the identity space is identity has always kind of been, and I always hate to use this pejoratively, it's not meant pejoratively, but it's always been the stepchild of security. It's kind of there. It's a forced relationship, but most security folks just don't want to have to deal with it. And yet, you wind up year after year after year. It shows up always in the OWASP top 10. It always shows up as one of the top vehicles in the Verizon data breach investigation reports and other vendors doing investigation reports as well. Identity is that layer that connects everything. And so that's why I was so enamored with the mission of IDPro of how do we create a community. And to be fair, IAPP was kind of our model for that, of saying, how can we bring together professionals that have that strong common interest, and recognizing that the fastest way these people can develop is by working together within the community. I mean, we've heard countless times from people that I talk to that are IDPro members that just the participation on the Slack site alone is worth its weight in gold. Because instead of going to a Reddit or some other online forum where you may get some decent answers, you can go onto the IDPro Slack site and you can talk with some of the people who actually built the standards that you have questions about, or they're actively working with the products that you have questions about, or you can talk with other people that are experiencing similar pain points. And so having a community to build around that, there's just a natural affinity between that of how do we help nurture those younger professionals that are just entering the space, whether it's at the college level or in the young professional level, and get them interfacing with people who are mid-career and maybe thinking about, hey, what's my next step with respect to that? Are there other aspects of identity that I want to play with? Do I want to fork off into privacy? Maybe that's more interesting to me. And so having a community that's built to foster that as a profession, it was just a natural fit for me. And I'm hugely bullish on their mission and where we're going with it.
So if there was one thing that you could actually ask your fellow mid-career professionals to do with regards to supporting those fresh out of college or new to the space, what would you ask them to do?
I think the biggest one is just making sure that people know that you're available. Because we live in an asynchronous world. That's the beauty of Slack is you're not going to be interacting with somebody down the hall as often, especially now that post-pandemic, more and more of us are remote, including myself. And so the hallway conversations are less of an item. So having those equivalent of hallway conversations in Slack on LinkedIn's becoming a fantastic resource as well. Make yourself available to those people, whether it's going to a local security conference and maybe speaking at that conference. If you haven't gotten out of that comfort zone, or maybe you want to work with somebody on that front. One of the things that I love that Dean Sachs did at Identiverse last year was he wound up speaking at 4 different slots, but really what he was doing there was supporting some younger members of his team at AWS and helping them get comfortable with sharing what they know. And that's really, I joke about this sometimes with some of my colleagues that when I ask for documentation on a system, I'll say, look, the shamanistic tradition of telling stories isn't necessarily the best way to achieve that. But actually in this community, it kind of is. Now, that being said, and this is a full pitch for you, Heather, we need to document some of those wonderful stories as well. And that's why the body of knowledge is such a, just completely invaluable resource for the community. Because the first thing I will do if somebody, hits my inbox and says, hey, I want to learn more about identity, where do I start? The first place I send them is the body of knowledge. I said, don't get overwhelmed. Pick an article and read it and think about it. And then the good news is there's a good chance if you had questions, you could either talk to the person who authored that article or talk to other people in the Slack channel or on LinkedIn to gain more knowledge on that. So if you're a mid-career professional, if you're looking for how you can help, that's the biggest way you can do it. Now, I will pivot slightly in answering that selfishly and say one of the things that I am trying to do with this identity course is make it much bigger than what I'm doing at UNC Charlotte. And that is, I am creating this course in a fashion that I want everybody to have access to it. So I'm going to be open sourcing it. The entire curriculum is going to be available on LinkedIn, on GitHub, same company, or at least ownership company. But it's going to be available on GitHub, and it's going to be cafeteria style. So you can, if you just want to pluck it out as a module within your overarching course, say in the sociology department, and talk about issues of citizen identity within your own class, it can be a resource for you. And if you're mid-career and you're thinking about contributing in that space, come talk to me. I'll be making some posts here very soon on LinkedIn and IDPro to hopefully help facilitate that. But those are all areas in which someone who is mid-career can make contributions, and never, never, never discount your experiences as being invaluable for somebody else. We always think is like, I don't really know that much. And I always answer on the IDPro skills survey, there's always a question that says, how long did it take you to feel like you're proficient in this industry? And I always say I still don't, because I just have this learning mindset that, especially because of the rate of change in the industry, I'm constantly trying to learn. And that's part of what I love about it. It keeps it exciting. It's not, there's never a page that I turn and I go, oh, I'm done with that book. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. Oh, that's perfect. One thing I wanted to touch on, you mentioned security kind of viewing identity as like the stepchild of the work that they do. Is there a way in which you explain identity or frame it in a way that gets people excited about working on identity?
I do, or I try to, I should say. I will say for my students, I actually borrow this a little bit from Andre Duran's. I can't remember which keynote it was, but when I started evangelizing the idea of companies were becoming enamored with this concept of digital transformation, they knew they had to get online or die. And one of the key challenges that his company at the time was trying to get people to understand was how critical identity was to that equation. And so I will ask my students, both in either class, when we start talking about security, I introduce that concept. And then obviously in identity, we talk about it, is every experience that you have in the digital realm starts with what? You got to log in.
Yeah.
And so how well we design that experience and how seamless that experience is you're navigating across the various features of the sites that you're in are absolutely critical. So in some ways, the security community should be a little jealous of us, because we are the one aspect of this that I can point to and say, I can have a direct impact on your return on investment. It's not just protecting you from breaches. That's absolutely critical to what we do. But if I can do something that delights my users from an identity perspective, even though they're not going to call it identity, they're just going to say, this is really easy to do. Man, that's worth its weight in gold.
I love it. Right before the podcast, one of the things that we ask is, hey, is there anything that you want to really talk about? And you wanted to talk about this concept of mastery versus performance. And mastery is actually one of the things that I teach, and a lot of the stuff that I teach throughout, my entire career. And if I could almost encapsulate it the way I think you might be thinking about it, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but it's almost like a temporal variable where mastery is like, hey, I'm thinking about the future. Like it's a path. Like the future is always in front of me, but performance is like, I want to be the best and operate the best I can right in this very moment. Is that kind of the differences there? And what else did you learn about mastery versus performance?
I think that's a great way of encapsulating it. So much of identity, and I've been trying for a long time. When I first started my segue into public speaking about identity, I used my life with horses as an example, and I had countless horse stories that I could play with, and they worked well. And then my horse is now retired. She's quite happy with that. So the stories don't exactly, create themselves on their own. And what I've pivoted to personally is running, and particularly endurance running. And what I came to realize, and this was really only in the past month or so, is identity really is an endurance sport. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that it created as part of that process, because I'm 55 years old, so I'm not breaking any records. I'm not going to stand on any podiums. This is a great time with the Olympics going on. And this was kind of the nice segue for the conversation was those Olympic athletes are looking to capture lightning in a bottle so that for whatever interval that they have within that stage, they can perform at the top of their game.
Right.
That's not what I'm trying to do. And it would be a very poor time to attempt to do that, given where I am in my career and my life. But what we can do is focus on mastery. And it's such a great segue into identity because the last 3 jobs that I've had, companies have been at various different points in their journey from an identity perspective. And you always try and you're measuring some of the exact same things every time. How well are you onboarding users? How well are you offboarding users? How well are you tackling that very difficult subject of what happens when somebody gets promoted or changes organizations within your company? That mover use case, that's always one of the stickiest wickets. And some companies want to dive in and tackle that use case first. And I'm like, you may want to hold off on that. And so that's where we look at the mastery, like how, what is the experience for your employees or in the Dick's lexicon, we call them teammates. What is the experience for them when they join an organization, and how can we master that experience? And you can measure that. That's the great thing about it. And that's where mastery becomes so critical, because especially for someone like me who isn't an Olympic athlete, I can look at mastery from a running perspective, and I can look at little things and go, how is this going? And sometimes it's moment to moment. Like, I'll just use yesterday as a really good example. I was nearing the end of the run and my body was just going, dude, you hiked a mountain yesterday. You're tired, and what can I do in that moment? And I always come back to, how's my form? Am I executing these individual processes in a consistent fashion? And if I can do that, even if I'm slowing down a little bit, that helps me avoid injury, which means I can run more. And so in the identity space, it's the same thing. How well are we repeating those processes, whether it's getting access to an application and seeing how well my single sign-on platform is working, or whether I'm doing an access certification? If we can take those little processes and master them, that's what creates a great and mature identity program. And so that's where I started to sink into that concept of moving towards mastery as part of it.
Shoot, that's a podcast by itself.
Be a fun one to talk about for sure.
We have to bring you back on. Lance, thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for taking time out of your busy schedule to hop on the mics with Heather and I. Thank you to all the viewers and listeners out there, and a special thank you to IDPro and AKI Identity for allowing Heather and I to do this search for knowledge and wisdom in the field of identity. Thanks, everybody. And with that, we'll see everyone next time.